So, here's something royal watchers certainly didn't see coming. Princess Diana's niece has reportedly stepped forward with a response that has put Meghan Markle and Prince Harry under intense scrutiny, and the reaction has been anything but quiet. What makes this especially surprising is the family connection and the questions surrounding Diana's legacy. But the biggest shock may be what she allegedly said about the Sussexes and why her words have sparked such a strong reaction. So, what really happened and what does this mean for the royal family? Let's find out. When family lines harden, and that's where the story takes its first unexpected turn. Because once Diana's niece enters the conversation, this stops feeling like another argument between the Sussexes and the royal establishment. Suddenly, the family connection changes everything. That relationship creates an uncomfortable tension almost immediately. Harry has spent years speaking about Diana from the perspective of a son who lost his mother young. His memories are deeply personal. Meghan, meanwhile, has become part of that story through her marriage to him, public appearances, and moments when Diana's influence has been discussed alongside their lives. But here's where things changed. The public began paying closer attention whenever Diana's name appeared beside Harry and Meghan, because every reference seemed to raise the same question. Were they preserving her memory or creating a new interpretation of it? And this is where the niece's position becomes fascinating. There is no verified direct statement in the reference material proving that Diana's niece delivered a specific brutal line to Harry and Meghan. What the material does establish is the larger dispute surrounding Diana's legacy. Who should control the story? Who should speak about it? And where family loyalty ends? Now, picture the contrast. On one side is Harry, carrying memories of his mother into adulthood and choosing to speak publicly about them. On the other is a family that has repeatedly treated Diana's private world as something deserving protection. That difference is where the tension lives. Because when someone from Diana's own family appears to draw a boundary, audiences naturally want to know what caused it. Was it disagreement with Harry and Meghan personally? Was it concerned about Diana's legacy? Or was something much deeper happening beneath the surface? What nobody realized was that the real story wasn't simply about one alleged rejection. It was about a family legacy becoming contested territory. And next, we have to understand why Diana's name became so inseparable from Harry and Meghan's public story in the first place. And once that connection is examined, another layer begins to emerge. Diana's legacy was never just photographs, memories, and famous moments. It became a powerful emotional symbol that different people could interpret in completely different ways. For Harry, that legacy could represent grief, identity, and a bond that survived her death. For the Spencer family, it could also represent something private and complicated, worthy of careful protection. Public admiration can also simplify complicated family histories. Millions remember the princess they saw through photographs and television, while relatives remember the person behind those images. And that leaves us with the question hanging over everything that follows. When two sides believe they are protecting the same woman's memory, what happens when their definitions of protection collide? And suddenly, the silence raises a bigger question. What did Diana's family legacy mean to the niece watching all of this unfold? Was she seeing something the public had missed? And why might her perspective become impossible to ignore when the next revelation finally emerges? Keep watching. Diana's shadow, between them. And that question takes us straight to the heart of the story. Diana's name did not remain in the past. It followed Harry into adulthood, into his marriage, and eventually into almost every major conversation surrounding the Sussexes. Okay, so let's talk about why Diana became such a powerful presence around Harry and Meghan. Harry knew her as his mother, not as the icon the world remembers. That distinction matters. His grief, memories, and understanding of her were shaped by childhood, loss, and years of living with a story the public never stopped discussing. Then Meghan entered that picture, and suddenly Diana's legacy gained another layer. Public attention repeatedly focused on Meghan wearing jewelry associated with Diana, including the aquamarine ring seen around the couple's 2018 wedding. Some viewers interpreted those choices as affectionate tributes, meaningful connections between a son, his mother, and the woman he married. But here's where things became complicated. Critics began questioning whether those references encouraged a comparison that was bigger than the jewelry itself. Harry had also spoken publicly about Diana, his childhood, and the lasting effect of losing her. In some discussions, Meghan's experiences were placed alongside Diana's, creating an emotional parallel that supporters considered understandable, while critics considered it too simplistic. And this is where it gets interesting, because Diana's family could see the same story from an entirely different angle. For Harry, Diana was his mother. For her Spencer relatives, she was a sister, daughter, aunt, and family member whose life existed long before the world turned her into an icon. Those perspectives overlap, but they are not identical. That difference changes the argument. Imagine carrying memories of someone privately while watching the world continually reinterpret that person publicly. Every interview, photograph, piece of jewelry, or comparison can feel meaningful to one audience and uncomfortable to another. What nobody realized was that this disagreement over Diana's image was creating a much bigger question. Who gets to decide what honoring her looks like? And once that question entered the picture, the niece's position became more intriguing, because she wasn't simply observing Harry and Meghan from a distance. She was connected to both sides of Diana's legacy. So, what happens when someone standing inside that family chooses not to echo the narrative everyone expects? That is where the story moves next, to the moment when Diana's niece and Harry and Meghan shared the same stage. And that encounter matters, because shared family history can make even a seemingly ordinary moment carry extraordinary weight. What might outsiders dismiss as a simple interaction can look different to relatives who remember Diana beyond the photographs, headlines, and public image. The stage was set, yet the real tension had only begun. The wedding looked like a picture of unity, but how long could that image survive? What changed behind the scenes after the celebrations ended? And why would Diana's family connections suddenly carry a different meaning? Was the real story only beginning to unfold? Let's find out. The wedding that changed everything. And that brings us to the wedding, because this is where the story becomes almost impossible to ignore. Picture Windsor in May 2018. Crowds pressed behind barriers, cameras searching for every familiar face, and inside St. George's Chapel, Harry and Meghan preparing to begin a completely different chapter. Among the guests was Kitty Spencer, Diana's niece and Harry's cousin. Her presence carried a quiet significance. She was not simply another celebrity in a carefully assembled crowd. She belonged to Diana's family, meaning that somewhere inside that enormous royal celebration was a living connection to the woman whose memory had shaped Harry's life. Okay, so let's pause there for a second. At that moment, nobody could know how dramatically the Sussex story would eventually change. The wedding projected unity. Harry and Meghan appeared surrounded by relatives, friends, and members of the wider royal circle. The atmosphere was celebratory, almost reassuring, as though the complicated history surrounding the family had temporarily disappeared beneath the pageantry. And this is where it gets interesting. Diana's niece was standing inside, a moment that seemed to bring two worlds together: Harry's future with Meghan and Diana's family legacy. For viewers watching from outside, that connection could easily look symbolic. The Spencer family and the royal family were sharing the same room, while Diana's memory quietly hovered over the entire occasion. But the years that followed would change the meaning of that picture. Harry and Meghan eventually stepped away from senior royal duties and built a life increasingly separate from the institution that had defined so much of Harry's childhood. Their interviews and public projects brought renewed attention to family disagreements, while Harry continued discussing the impact of losing Diana. Suddenly, the cheerful wedding photographs belonged to a very different story. What nobody realized was that the people smiling for cameras that day would later occupy very different positions in the public conversation surrounding Diana's legacy. The distance between the Sussexes and the wider royal family would grow, while every new discussion involving Diana seemed to carry another layer of emotion. And that leaves us with an intriguing question. When the wedding represented togetherness, what happened afterward to make those connections feel so complicated? Because the next chapter isn't really about one dramatic disagreement. It is about the moment the family landscape itself began changing, and why Diana's memory became caught directly in the middle. And perhaps that is what makes Kitty's connection so intriguing. She was close enough to understand the family story, yet distant enough to see its tensions from another angle. Could that position eventually make her role far more important than anyone expected, especially when Diana's legacy became a source of disagreement again? Then came a question that reached beyond Harry himself. Could Diana's family remain silent as her legacy became part of a new public battle? And what happens when someone from inside that family finally chooses a side? Could her words change everything? Stay with us. When the royal distance grew, and that is where the picture from 2018 begins to fade. The warmth of the wedding could not last, and the atmosphere changed, because Harry and Meghan's relationship with the royal institution soon entered a different phase once the cameras moved away. Okay, so let's talk about what changed. The Sussexes stepped away from senior royal duties and began building an independent public life. That changed the distance between them and the family they had once represented alongside, making every later statement feel heavier. Their decisions became part of a larger public conversation about family and independence. Then came the interviews, documentaries, speeches, and eventually Harry's memoir. The private world of the royal family was suddenly being discussed in ways that invited millions into conversations that had remained behind palace doors. And at the center of many of those discussions was Diana. Harry spoke about losing his mother, the effect that loss had on him, and the memories he carried into adulthood. Supporters saw that openness as understandable. Diana was his mother, and nobody else could experience that loss from exactly the same place. For Harry, speaking about her could explain his life through the person whose death had shaped it. But critics saw another problem emerging. The more Harry discussed Diana, the easier it became for the public to compare his experiences with the controversy surrounding Meghan. The parallels might have been meaningful to Harry, yet they created a new argument over whether Diana's story was being used to understand another chapter. And this is where it gets interesting. Because once Diana's name became part of those wider conversations, the debate was no longer limited to Harry and Meghan. Her relatives were pulled toward it, carrying memories of Diana that existed before she became the mother of two princes. The Spencer family had history with her, They knew the woman behind the photographs, the sister behind the headlines, and the family member whose life could never be reduced to royal controversy. That did not make them right, but it made their silence meaningful whenever Diana's name returned to public debate. What nobody realized was that the growing distance between Harry and the wider family was also creating a new question for Diana's relatives. Where does personal remembrance end? And where does another person's version of Diana begin? Those questions became harder to ignore as interpretations collided. For Diana's family, this was not simply a disagreement. It touched something intimate, the right to remember a beloved relative without seeing that memory reshaped by circumstances they did not control. That question would make the niece's position consequential because the next chapter moves beyond disagreement and into something much more personal: loyalty. So, what exactly did the niece refuse to endorse? And why could that boundary carry consequences far beyond one private disagreement? Was her message really about Harry and Meghan, or something deeper? And what happens when that boundary finally becomes impossible to ignore? Stay glued. Loyalty has another meaning, and that distinction changes everything, because family loyalty does not always mean public agreement. Sometimes loving someone means standing beside them. Other times, it means refusing to follow them. That matters when the family carries Diana's complicated legacy. So, let's look at the Spencer side of the story. Diana's relatives inherited something complicated: memories of a woman who belonged to their family long before strangers claimed a connection to her. Her children experienced Diana as their mother. Her wider family knew her through different relationships and chapters. That difference matters because perspective can shape what loyalty looks like. Harry can speak about Diana from the place only a son can occupy. He remembers his mother through childhood memories, grief, family experiences, and everything afterward. His connection is personal. Yet, a relative like Kitty Spencer occupies another position. She belongs to the family that knew Diana before royal titles, global fame, and endless speculation transformed her into an international symbol. And this is where the story becomes more interesting. A disagreement with Harry or Meghan does not automatically mean rejection of them. It could simply mean drawing a boundary around what someone believes should remain personal. That distinction can disappear when every royal disagreement becomes a headline. Imagine the pressure on Diana's younger relatives. They inherited a legacy they never asked to create, yet they are surrounded by expectations about what they should say, defend, remember, or avoid. Their position can instantly be interpreted as taking sides. What nobody realized was that the real tension might not be about whether Harry and Meghan deserve affection. It could be about whether affection requires agreement. That is a completely different question, and it changes how the dispute should be understood. You can love a cousin without endorsing every public decision. You can respect a marriage without agreeing with every story. And you can protect a family memory without believing that person is attacking anyone. Sometimes the strongest expression of loyalty is knowing where to draw the line. For Kitty, that distinction would matter if she ever addressed the controversy publicly. Her connection to Diana gives her perspective weight, but it does not automatically make her the spokesperson for the Spencer family, nor does it prove that she has publicly rejected Harry and Meghan. So, the story becomes more complicated than a family feud ever suggests, because the most revealing part of any alleged message would not necessarily be the person it challenged. It would be the boundary it established. Once that boundary enters conversation, every word carries a different meaning. What looked like disagreement could become something far more personal, and next we reach the moment when that boundary becomes impossible to ignore. The confrontation may have revealed only the surface. What was really behind those cutting words? Who was the message truly meant to reach? And why does the next revelation make the entire dispute surrounding Diana's legacy suddenly look very different? Stay tuned. The boundary nobody expected. And this is where the story reaches its most uncomfortable point. After everything we have seen, the wedding, the growing distance, and the arguments over Diana's legacy, the question is no longer whether Harry and Meghan can tell their story. It is whether everyone connected to Diana must accept that version. Okay, so let's talk about the alleged shutdown. The available reference material does not provide a verified direct statement from Diana's niece attacking Harry or Meghan, so we should be careful here. What it does reveal is a deeper conflict surrounding Diana's memory. Private family understanding on one side, and a public storytelling on the other. That distinction makes the supposed message far more interesting than a dramatic insult ever could. Imagine hearing a boundary from someone who belongs to Diana's own family. It would carry a different emotional weight because this would not be criticism coming from a commentator, journalist, or distant royal observer. It would come from someone connected to the woman at the center of the entire conversation. The strongest interpretation is not necessarily that Diana's niece was rejecting Harry or Meghan personally. It could be that she was refusing to accept the idea that one person's experience should automatically become the definitive version of Diana's legacy. That is a much harder position to dismiss. Harry has every reason to remember his mother through his own experiences. Meghan has her own relationship with Diana's memory through Harry and the family she married into. Yet Diana's relatives possess memories that belong to an entirely different part of her life. So when those perspectives collide, the emotional stakes become enormous. What nobody expected was how easily a disagreement about Diana could become a disagreement about family identity itself. And suddenly, the alleged brutal part of the story looks different. The severity may not come from harsh words at all. It may come from refusing to participate in a narrative that someone else considers deeply personal. That would explain why even silence could become significant. Because sometimes the strongest family boundary is not an attack. It is a refusal to endorse. And if that is what the story is really about, then Harry and Meghan may not have been the true target. The deeper issue is something much larger. Who gets to decide which version of Diana survives? That question becomes even more complicated when the people closest to Diana remember her in ways the public never witnessed. Her children knew one side of her. Her siblings and nieces knew another. Friends and admirers formed still more versions from moments shared with them. None of those perspectives can completely capture one person. Yet public attention often demands a simple answer. It wants someone to be right, someone to be wrong, and someone to deliver the final word. Diana's legacy refuses to fit so neatly into that structure. For Harry, protecting his mother's memory may mean speaking openly about experiences that shaped him. For her wider family, protecting that same memory might mean resisting interpretations they believe leave out important context. Neither position automatically proves betrayal, and neither automatically proves protection. That is why this controversy remains difficult to settle. The alleged shutdown may have been less about hostility and more about ownership, boundaries, and the limits of personal memory. And once that possibility enters the story, everything changes. The question is no longer simply what was said or whether anyone was truly shut down. The question becomes who has the authority to define Diana after all these years, and What happens when the people who loved her most disagree? Who really gets to define Diana's legacy when every side remembers a different woman? Was her story ever truly anyone's to control? And what happens when a family boundary collides with a world that refuses to let Diana's memory belong only to them? Let's unravel the mystery. Diana belonged to many worlds. And that question takes us somewhere much deeper, because Diana was never only one thing. She was Harry's mother, William's mother, Charles Spencer's sister, a relative to the wider Spencer family, and eventually a global figure whose image belonged, in some sense, to everyone who remembered her. Okay, so let's talk about the impossible part. Harry has a perspective nobody can replace. He experienced Diana as his mother, felt her absence as a child, and carried those memories into adulthood. When he speaks about her, he is describing a relationship that belongs uniquely to him. But Diana's story existed long before Harry became an adult, and her family knew parts of her life that the public never saw. Her relatives remember the person behind the photographs, while millions remember the princess they watched through television screens and newspaper pages. The Spencer connection creates another layer. Diana's family was not simply connected to her because she became royal. They belonged to her life before the palace, before international attention, and before every decision surrounding her became part of a global conversation. And this is where it gets interesting. Nobody actually possesses the complete Diana. Harry has memories his relatives cannot duplicate. Her siblings have memories her children never experienced. Friends remember moments family members may never have witnessed. The public remembers a woman whose charitable work, compassion, and vulnerability made her extraordinary. Put those perspectives together, and you still may not have the whole person. That is why arguments about Diana's legacy become so emotionally charged. When Harry talks about his mother, some people hear a son preserving memories. Critics may hear a story being continually reopened. And when her relatives remain cautious, others can interpret that silence as disapproval, even when the evidence does not establish such a conclusion. What makes the niece's position so complicated is that she sits directly inside this middle ground. She belongs to Diana's family, yet she is also part of a generation that inherited the consequences of decisions made long before her. So, the question is no longer simply whether she supports Harry and Meghan. It is whether she believes honoring Diana requires agreeing with every interpretation of her life. Once that question is asked honestly, the supposed shutdown begins to look less like an attack and more like a boundary, one that forces everyone to reconsider what Diana's legacy actually belongs to. Perhaps this is why controversy feels so personal. It is not about a woman who died decades ago. It is about competing memories and loyalties. For Harry, remembering Diana may mean protecting the bond he lost. For her relatives, protecting Diana means preserving a version of her life outside the royal narrative. Perhaps the real question is not who betrayed Diana, but who truly understands what protecting her legacy demands. Was Kitty defending a memory, challenging Harry and Meghan, or exposing something deeper? And when the final pieces come together, will Diana's family see her legacy differently? What Diana's legacy demands? And that brings us to the final question. Because after everything we have uncovered, the word brutal feels less straightforward. Was the alleged stance really an attack on Harry and Meghan? Or was it simply a boundary drawn around Diana's memory? Okay, so let's put the pieces together. Harry remains the person who knew Diana as his mother. Meghan became part of that family story through her marriage to him. and Kitty Spencer occupies an unusual position between those worlds, Diana's niece and Harry's cousin. That connection changes the emotional temperature. A criticism from an outsider could be dismissed as commentary. A disagreement from someone inside Diana's family feels different. It carries history, shared blood, childhood memories, and the uncomfortable knowledge that everyone involved may remember the same woman differently. Here's where things become harder to judge. The deeper we look, the more difficult it becomes to divide this story into heroes and villains. Harry may genuinely believe that speaking about Diana keeps her memory alive. His supporters can reasonably argue that a son should be allowed to remember his mother publicly, especially when that loss shaped his entire life. At the same time, Diana's relatives can reasonably believe that remembrance does not require every private memory, interpretation, or comparison to become part of the public conversation. And this is where it gets interesting. Kitty's position, viewed through that wider family context, does not necessarily have to mean hostility toward Harry or Meghan. It could represent something quieter, a refusal to treat Diana's legacy as belonging exclusively to one perspective. That distinction matters because Diana cannot speak anymore. Everyone connected to her is left carrying a fragment of the story, while the public continues trying to assemble those fragments into one complete picture. What nobody realized was that the real conflict was never simply Spencer versus Sussex. It was memory versus interpretation. It was family history versus public storytelling. And ultimately, it was about where one person's right to remember ends and another person's responsibility to protect begins. So, when we return to that headline about Diana's niece supposedly shutting down Harry and Meghan, perhaps the most important question is not whether the response was brutal. Perhaps it is whether a boundary can feel brutal, simply because nobody expected someone inside Diana's family to draw it. And that leaves us with a question that may never have a simple answer. Who should shape Diana's legacy? Her children, her family, or the millions who still feel they know her? Maybe the uncomfortable truth is that honoring Diana has never meant the same thing to everyone. And perhaps that is why every new disagreement over her memory feels so personal, even decades later. So, what do you think? Was Diana's niece right to draw a hard line around her family's legacy, or did she go too far? Share your thoughts below. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.